Do mass shootings ever change the politics of gun safety in America? Top Democrats think the answer is yes, as they pressure Mitch McConnell.
We are calling on Leader McConnell to bring the bill that passed the House.
Senator McConnell has to call up that gun legislation for a vote. We have waited for too long.
And today, I say to Mitch McConnell, Republican leader in the Senate, stop allowing the NRA to dictate gun policy in America.
Speaker Pelosi has already sent gun safety bills to the Senate. McConnell rejecting these calls for an immediate vote. So that's one answer to the question of whether shootings change the politics. At the level of Mitch McConnell, anyway. But here's another level, where McConnell's old Senate colleague Mike DeWine is now governor in the Republican-leaning state of Ohio. And you're hearing the sound of constituents shouting him down as they reeled from that state's shooting. Does it make a difference? Here's some new headlines right out of Ohio. Governor proposes new gun control laws marking shift from past GOP leadership. Or Republican governor wants courts to take guns from people, as he now backs bills the Republican legislature there had resisted. We're joined now by conservative Bill Kristol, a man with some Republican experience. How are you, Bill?
Fine, Ari. How are you?
I'm good. What do you think about that scene in Ohio and the contrast to Washington?
Well, they're on recess here in Washington, which is yet another problem, right? There's various national crises and a sense of we need leadership. We're not going to get it from the president. Seems to me, if I were running either branch, I say this about Nancy Pelosi as well as about Mitch McConnell, I might try to reconvene for at least a few days to kind of at least suggest that our representatives are trying to deal with these problems. I understand that Pelosi doesn't think McConnell will do anything, so I suppose it would look a little futile. But, you know, it is a real breakdown of the democratic process. I think that's a point you just we've taken it for granted now. We heard Chuck Schumer, I think, at the beginning, a minute ago, say, you know, I'm calling on Leader McConnell to bring up the bill. What kind of democracy is this? I mean, if one house passes a bill, the other house should put it through committee, bring it up. It can defeat it. It can amend it. It might not become law. The president might veto it. There might not be the votes to override the veto. That's fine. That's democracy. But both on gun control, election security, where there are Republican co-sponsors of several bills, McConnell just says, I'm not bringing it up. It really is not the way democracy and the way the legislative branch is supposed to function. Right. And I wonder how it would work in a different administration. I mean, Mitch McConnell is dealing with a president who is completely uninterested in the details, even when he has, quote unquote, skin in the game. I also wonder what you think about the shifting politics, because Washington is a town that certainly cares about history. It's sort of very, institutional, old-fashioned in that way, but sometimes lives too long in old historical lessons. Here's a report from Bloomberg on the political dynamics of guns. Some Republicans raising alarms the opposition to new certain firearm limits could be toxic to suburban women and college grads who shape 2020. Do you think that the quote-unquote lessons of gun politics have been overlearned in Washington? Yes, very much so. And I think you really need to combine the lessons of gun politics, election security politics, with the lessons of kind of democracy. I mean, the assault weapon ban, I believe, was passed in 1994, repealed in 2004, let to expire, and there weren't the votes to pass it in 2004. But at least there were votes. I mean, we saw what congressmen and women, members and senators had an obligation to step forward. But why isn't McConnell bringing it to a vote? Not because he doesn't have the votes or he's worried about putting his members on the spot. And I think making that point and putting pressure on members, on senators who are vulnerable, not just in 2020, but more broadly, who have ambitions in the future. Say, Marco Rubio, you co-sponsored an election security bill. Have you done anything to put any pressure on, to even ask Mitch McConnell to pass it? And the same with on the gun measures, where there are some Republicans who are willing. Pat Toomey, who's been in favor of certain gun measures, may not be exactly the one the House passed. So I do think pressure across the board is important, not just on McConnell, not just appeals to McConnell, but pressure on a whole bunch of Republican senators, Republican Congress, members of Congress, to really change this situation.
When you were in a Republican administration, which, as I mentioned, is in the past, but did the NRA sort of dictate these things? Was there no room to ever make an exception?
No, I mean, some Republicans voted, I think, for the '94 assault weapon ban, and there were, I believe, measures during the first Bush administration, which is when I was there, that curbed some aspects of guns. But look, I mean, George Mitchell was a very tough majority leader of the Senate, a Democrat from Maine, when I was in the Bush White House. He was against, for example, the first Gulf War. It didn't occur to him that he wouldn't let it come to a vote, though.
Right.
You know, I mean, I find that part really astonishing. We have a national crisis here. Everyone agrees upon it, and the Senate is on recess. The House is on recess too, and the Senate in particular, though, they're both on recess. And we get no votes, no accountability, no committee hearings, no nothing, right, on election security, on gun control, and on other issues as well.
Bill Kristol reminding everyone that if it looks bad, it's actually worse. But in the case of Mitch McConnell, maybe that's something people want to assess because we are still a democracy if people want to do something about any of it. Thank you, as always, for joining us.
Thanks.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.